The Legend of Zelda is one of the most recognizable video game franchises of all time, spawning many games throughout its life, with two of them being considered some of the best games ever made, those being Ocarina of Time and Breath of the Wild. It is hard not to think of Nintendo's flagship titles without thinking about Zelda. Now, how did I get into the Zelda series? Well, I was growing between the 6th generation and 7th generation of consoles, which means I was exposed to both generations of games and consoles. My first Zelda game was Wind Waker on the GameCube, which is kind of funny to think about, cause back then, this was the Zelda game people were not big on. So for me to love it as much as I did back then is kind of hilarious to me. But yeah, I started with Wind Waker, and while the disc was beyond repair, as in would crash before reaching Dragon Roost Island, I still loved it a lot and poured hours just into exploring my home island. But for a long time, I only played Wind Waker. It didn't take until my teen years where I finally got more into the Zelda series. I played Breath of the Wild, Minish Cap, Phantom Hourglass, Skyward Sword, Ocarina of Time, and Majora's Mask. Nowadays, I have played most of the Zelda games, with the exception of the Oracle games. But the games I rarely if ever think about in this franchise are the games that started in the first place, which are Zelda 1 and Zelda 2. I basically just spelled out the video in my video. Basically, I just want to spend this video looking into the first two Zelda games and seeing how they have started off the franchise. I was originally gonna do two separate videos on these games, but I don't really have much NES game review experiences, which was shown pretty well with how short my Metroid 1 review was. I really need to redo that video. But I feel like these two Zelda games have a lot more in common with each other than any other Zelda game, aside from Breath of the Wild in the case of Zelda 1. So with all that out of the way, let's jump into this incarnation of Hyrule. Zelda 1 was the brainchild behind Shigeru Miyamoto, who wanted to make a game where people wandered around a world and discovered new things as they went along, and they drew his experiences from when he was a kid and would explore the woods. While Zelda 1 didn't really invent the adventure genre, but I would say that both this game and Castlevania 2 innovated the genre closer to what it is today. So for now, let's get started with this review, and I would go into the typical order where I talk about the story, presentation, gameplay, and endgame. But in terms of a story, there really isn't much of a story in this game, which makes sense because this was a world pre-RPG world when Zelda 1 came out, where story wasn't really as prevalent as it is nowadays. The basic gist of the story is that Ganon has taken over the world of Hyrule. If you are tired of me saying that or something similar to it, I would not be surprised that you go insane after a while of these videos. He stole the Triforce of Power, but he was stopped temporarily by Princess Zelda as she split the Triforce of Wisdom into 8 pieces, but Ganon took her instead. So you, as the main character, Link, are tasked on a quest to restore the Triforce of Wisdom and to take down Ganon once and for all. In terms of things to talk about regarding the story, I do think it is very interesting that in this game, there are only 2 pieces to the Triforce, which are the Triforce of Power and the Triforce of Wisdom. The Triforce of Courage has been in the Zelda series for a long time that it feels weird not to have the Triforce of Courage in a Zelda game. But the Triforce of Courage will show up in the next game. But then again, it is still weird that it isn't in the first game. But other than that, Zelda's 1 story is as bare bones as most stories from this era of video games. They don't really hit their stride until the SNES and Sega Genesis, I would say. In terms of presentation, this is an early NES game, and even then, it's far from one of the best NES games in terms of its graphics. Nowadays, the best looking games on Nintendo consoles are primarily gonna be from Nintendo or Monolith Soft, as they really know the power of their consoles. But back in the NES days, most NES games developed by Nintendo themselves didn't really do much with the color palette, leading to some okay looking games. It was mainly third-party companies like Konami and Capcom that really knew how to take advantage of the NES color palette and make games that still look appealing to this day, with Mega Man 6 still being the best looking NES game that I have played. But when comparing Zelda to the likes of Mario and Metroid, it doesn't look as good as a Mario, but it is slightly better than a Metroid. Zelda doesn't have much color to it, with the game mainly using a mixture of greens, browns, and tan color ground, which makes the game feel like it is taking place in a random desert. I'm not saying that Zelda should be on the same level as the third-party games of the same system, but I feel like a little more detail in the environments would make the game look more interesting. Link looks fine, the enemies tend to look fine overall, and Ganon looks fine. I have almost nothing to say about the sprites of this game. What makes this game look better than Metroid is that while having a similar area design as Metroid, Zelda is not covered in black like Metroid, and whenever Zelda goes somewhere new, it isn't a copy-paste area. But I will still say that Mario Bros. 1 and 2 look better than Zelda in terms of Nintendo developed NES games. In terms of the soundtrack, there really aren't many songs to talk about. I said back in the Metroid video that I am typically not a big fan of most 8-bit music, since it all tends to use the same sounds that makes it sound the same, but there are NES games out there that can make a standout soundtrack for the system that still sounds good to this day, like Mega Man 2 and Castlevania. But for Zelda, it typically has one song that you hear all the time, which is the overworld theme, but since you are mostly in the overworld looking for secrets and other stuff, I found this song to get really grating at times, which probably didn't help my feelings toward this game at all. Aside from that, you have two other songs, which are the dungeon theme and the final dungeon theme, which I didn't really pay much attention to as there was something else playing in my mind when I was playing the dungeon in this game. But I will get to that when I talk about my thoughts on the dungeons. Now let's get into the gameplay. The game starts quite literally in the middle of nowhere, as you are just plopped down in one screen of the map, and you make the decision to either go in the cave or travel north, east, or west. But since this game is so well known in the public conscious, you go in the cave and you are given your first weapon, which is a wooden sword, and then you go out and travel the world. Out of all the Zelda games out there, this and Breath of the Wild are the only Zelda games that really take advantage of being open. You are given your basic tools and are told to just go out and figure it out yourself, but I think this works better in Breath of the Wild than in the first Zelda game. Since Breath of the Wild didn't drop you in the game and told you what to do, you are given a small area to explore your surroundings and figure out the mechanics of the game, and then once you got the essential tool and understood the basics, you are then allowed to explore your heart's content. But in Zelda 1, you are just plopped down at the bottom of the map, which makes the first impression of the game back then probably interesting, but nowadays we have gone against that design philosophy, since it makes the game more confusing than anything. In terms of the controls of the game, they are very clunky to say the least. Now, I know that people complain about old games being clunky, and for some games I don't get it, like Metal Gear Solid 3, but for games from the NES era where we were just stepping our feet into making games, I think clunkiness is a valid critique. Zelda 1 is a top-down Zelda game, which means you travel up, down, left, and right. There are no diagonal movements in this game, so you are stuck in those movements. But I don't know if this is just me. I thought that sometimes when clicking one direction, Link would move a bit in the previous direction I was making him go, and then go the direction that my controller is telling him to go. I don't know if anyone else who played this game felt this, but it was something I noticed pretty easily. But other than that, you have the A and B button, which correspond to an item you use. The A button will always be the sword button in this game, and the B button will always be your tool button, which makes it pretty easy to understand. I don't really like sword combat in this game. Basically do a stab attack whenever you use the sword, but I feel the enemies were not designed around this sword combat, with my favorite example being the Darknuts. Darknuts is enemies that can only be attacked from the side or from the back, but since they move in random directions, it makes hitting them impossible, and since you are stationary when attacking, there's a high possibility that you will be hit in the process, which makes combat more of a chore. I will say that in the first half of the game, it isn't as bad since they give you some pretty lenient enemies to deal with, but in the second half, it starts to test my patience with all the types of enemies they give you. You have 8 tools in this game. The first one is bombs. They typically work how you expect bombs to work in a game like this, where they explode in a radius, which can make dealing with the Darknuts more plausible. Next is the boomerang, which really didn't feel all that useful to me. The bow and arrow, which is an item you need to beat the game, since defeating Ganon requires the silver arrow, but it's a bow and arrow, very typical item. The candle that can make a fire that can hurt enemies and light up rooms, but you are mostly going to use this item to find secrets in the overworld, but can be useful in certain dungeons. The recorder that could be useful for dealing with Dig Dodger and finding the entrance to one of the dungeons, but other than that, didn't really see any use for it. Food, which is used to progress through the 7th dungeon, but just like the recorder, I didn't really find any other uses for it. The loader is optional, but I recommend getting it as it allows you to buy potions, which you will most likely need to deal with in the second half of the game. Finally, there is the magic rod, which can be a useful attacking item as it shoots a beam across the room like the swords do at full health, but I didn't really use it that much. Now in terms of the overworld stuff, I applaud the idea behind it and think this was probably the coolest thing in the world to an 80s kid, but nowadays without a guide, the overworld can be really confusing. The game itself barely if ever tells you what to do or even gives you a hint of what to do. The structure may be fairly simple with you exploring the overworld for items, secrets, and the 8 dungeons. All you need to do to beat the game is to beat the 8 dungeons, get the piece of the Triforce of Wisdom, and defeat Ganon, which is very simple, especially compared to some other Zelda games in the franchise. But navigating the overworld can be really annoying. The first thing you will notice is that the map in the upper left hand corner of the game is not detailed and only shows the overworld screen that you are on, but they don't even bother showing a divide between overworld screens, so it just leads to the player getting confused more easily, I would say. But what also doesn't help is that sometimes the overworld screens that you go through can all look the same, which is a problem that exploration-based NES games suffer from, like Metroid and Castlevania 2. That's not to say there aren't any memorable overworld screens, because there are, like the opening screen you are in, the graveyard, and Death Mountain, because of the falling rocks, but I found that a majority of the time, the last screen I went to normally blends in with the last one, since the color palette isn't that diverse, and they tend to reuse many sprites from other screens, which also makes it hard to find the secrets in this game. In the overworld, there are hidden areas that reward you with many goodies like sword upgrades, heart containers, shops that can net you some upgrades, and a potion shop, which I recommend looking for since halfway through the game it gets hard. But finding secrets in the overworld can be cryptic as hell. Sometimes you are given a hint about what to do, but most of the time it feels like you have to guess where to place a bomb or flame to find certain secrets. Like, how was I supposed to know that using the candle on this part of the forest would net me a staircase that allows me to buy a potion, or that bombing this part of the wall would net me a shop that allows me to buy bait for the upcoming dungeon. It also doesn't help that you are limited on bombs and can only use the blue candle a certain number of times on a screen of the game, which makes the process of finding these secrets more unappealing. This is the major reason why I recommend playing this game with a guide. The game becomes less cryptic and tedious with its secrets, but it won't be a cakewalk because of the other half of the game, which are the dungeons. There are 9 dungeons in this game, and they are a bit interesting. Zelda is known for its dungeons for their layouts and puzzles, but obviously this is the first game, so there isn't gonna be much of that in this game. Aside from the last 2 dungeons, I think the layouts are pretty simple to follow, with them being pretty simple formations based on shapes and animals. There are secrets in the dungeons, but most of the time it regards bombing a wall inside certain rooms of the dungeon, which makes finding them even more of a hassle. And in terms of puzzles, they mostly come down to push this block after you killed every enemy in the room. The first 4 dungeons in the game, I would say, are the game at its best. They aren't super complex and they have a nice balanced difficulty curve. But as soon as you enter the 5th dungeon, that is when all hell breaks loose, because it is the dungeon that introduces the Darknots to the game, which I already talked about with their movements, patterns, and how you are supposed to attack them. And then when you enter the 6th dungeon, you are introduced to the wizard enemy, Wizrobes. Now the orange ones are fine, they don't bother me that much as they teleport around and you can see where they will spawn and only die in one hit, but the blue ones can go die in a hole, as when they come into eye contact with you, they will constantly shoot magic at you, which means that you will lose a lot of health. Even though you have the magic ring on, that allows you to lessen the amount of damage you take, and they take 3 hits to kill, which make them as much of a hassle to kill as the Darknots. I will admit it, I died a lot in the second half of this game, as the Darknots and the Wizrobes are the most annoying enemies to deal with in the game. The bosses were mostly whatever to me. They were pretty simple to beat, like attack the head of the Lazaphos, place bombs in front of Dodongo, etc. But then that takes us to the final dungeon, Death Mountain. Side note, I find it funny that the final dungeon is Death Mountain, when in future games it is in a castle or underground. Death Mountain is a confusing dungeon to traverse, with all the many keys you need to use to get to Ganon, and with all the Darknots and Wizrobes that are all over the dungeon, which makes it feel like a death pit. Even with the red ring you can get, that can reduce the damage you take even more than the blue ring, but all of that compares to the first time experience of fighting Ganon. If you know what you are doing, the boss is easy, but on a first attempt you are going to be so confused on what to do, because you have a limited amount of arrows you could shoot at him for the final blow, and also the fact that he is invisible and you need to hit him with your sword 4 times to reveal him to shoot the silver arrow at him. I will admit that I died on my first attempt when grabbing footage, since I forgot that arrows don't affect him when he is invisible, and then ran out of arrows when I needed them. But then on the second attempt, I beat him in less than a minute, saved Zelda, and connected the Triforce of Power to Wisdom, ending the game. Overall, the first Legend of Zelda is a classic for a reason, and I have a huge amount of respect for it, for kickstarting the series and innovating the adventure genre of games. But I think this game is a product of the time. It isn't worth revisiting nowadays. There are many things that this game does that would be implemented and expanded upon in future games, like the dungeons, overworld, and secrets, which while I had a problem with, did set the foundation for the series, but as a package, I think it is a game that was meant for the 80s and will forever be stuck in the 80s, with how it asks you to play the game for weeks to months on end to find everything, which isn't a bad thing, but nowadays is a product of its time. But it also doesn't help that the second half of the game can be a frustrating mess. Now let's jump ahead a year as we look into its sequel, back when sequels were a lot more different than what they are nowadays. Zelda 2 is very much different from the first Zelda game, and even future Zelda games, since when development started on Zelda 2, Miyamoto had the idea of creating a side-scrolling action game which didn't follow any of the systems that were made in Zelda 1. That would come in the next Zelda game, A Link to the Past. They also added in a leveling system, overworld encounters with an added luck factor to it, and a higher difficulty to extend playing sessions due to the lack of content in NES games at the time. Zelda 2 is a game I've only played once and never again, because this was the most infamous Zelda game at the entire library when I first played in middle school, that it was a frustrated game that was a product of its time. And now that I played it again for this video, I can definitely say that I did not like this game. It is one of my least favorite NES games with the likes of Castlevania 2, Metroid, and Mega Man 3. The story of Zelda 2 takes place after Zelda 1, as the title most likely suggested. 6 years after the defeat of Ganon and the rescue of Princess Zelda in the first game, Link gets a mark on the back of his left hand, which the nurse of Zelda, Impa, tells him how there is a third piece of the Triforce called the Triforce of Courage. Upon defeating the king, his son tried to find it, but the location was only given to Zelda, so the prince tried to force the truth from her, but when she refuses, he casts a spell that put her into a deep sleep, which she can only wake from once the Triforce is whole again, which makes Link go out and find it. Oh, and also enemies are now trying to kill Link as they believe that if they pour blood over Ganon's ashes, he will come back to life.
What the Sigma?
This is an NES story, so there isn't really a whole lot to say about it, but I do think it is interesting that the game gives an explanation as to why there are still enemies in the game. But I do find it funny that they are going through a gothic horror style revival for Ganon to revive him, and the game over screen seems to make it seem like it happened, so if Ganon or Ganondorf dies, I guess just kill your local Link to revive him. Extra pretty if he has found fresh. But yeah, the story is not the focus of this game like the original, it's more about the gameplay, but we need to talk presentation. Zelda 2 is still an early NES game and developed by Nintendo, so it won't stack up to the good looking NES games like Castlevania or Mega Man 6, or even Mario 2 and 3, but I do think that it is a huge step up from Zelda 1 in terms of its color palette. Compared to the drab palette that was Zelda 1, Zelda 2 has a lot more brighter colors with blue backdrops, brighter green for Link to contrast with the dark green on the ground, but the game still has its darker palette with the dungeons and mountain areas, but they aren't really all over the game like it was in Zelda 1, which makes this game look better than Zelda 1, but still far from being one of the best looking NES games of the time and to this day. The soundtrack is one that I don't really remember all that much compared to Zelda 1, and there weren't all that many memorable pieces in this game, but I could be wrong about that. Now we can move on to the core gameplay of this game, which is very interesting to look at. Zelda 2 differs from Zelda 1 in terms of its controls and systems rather than the overall structure. They wanted to work on a side-scrolling action game, like I said, which is exactly what Zelda 2 is. The overworld controls are pretty much the same as Zelda 1, where you can travel in any direction you want to, and use the X button to do some specific actions like destroy a boulder, reveal a hidden town, and reveal one of the dungeons in the game. So nothing that players who played the first game wouldn't understand very quickly, but the side-scrolling parts of the game are very different. The side-scrolling parts should feel pretty natural if you've played a Mario game before, where you can move side to side and use the A button to jump, which is kind of funny to me nowadays, because when I first played this game, I thought it was weird that the game had allowed you to jump, when nowadays, it's so normal for modern Zelda games to have the jump function, even the top-down Zelda games with Echoes of Wisdom. Just something I thought was funny in retrospect. Just like in the first game, you can slash your sword, but it's more of a jab in this game than a slash. But just like with the first game, I am not the biggest fan of the range on the sword, as it feels too short for it to really be all that effective. But it isn't as bad as Zelda 1, since when you attack an enemy, they are stopped for a second, and if you keep on attacking, they are stuck there till they are defeated by you, which is a system that is in your favor, and I am all for it, because it's something we'll talk about later in this segment. One new system added to this game is that Link can now do magic. When you click the start button, you open a menu that shows you all the magic you have access to and how many magic points they cost. But the game doesn't really tell you how much magic you have in terms of numbers, so you just have to gauge it when you use it. There are 8 spells in the game, and they can range from useful to waste of magic or situational. I'd say the most useful spells in the game are Shield and Life, as Shield reduces the damage you take, and Life restores your health bar for a certain certain bit, but some of the other ones are too situational or I didn't really find a use for them. Fairy is one that sounds useful, but it's mostly used for getting through certain sections of dungeons. Same with jump. You would think fire and thunder would be overpowered, but fire only shoots fire from your sword, and thunder is a screen nuke, but the screen nuke can't kill everything in one hit. So you might as well save it for the final boss of the game. One system that the game introduces that I think does not work for a game like this is the life system, which is only in this game. You have a set amount of lives, and when you lose all of them, you get a game over and have to go back to the palace Zelda is kept in, and retrace your steps to where you were last, which makes the game very unforgiving, since with some design decisions to talk about later, it makes this game not beginner friendly. I will say that you don't lose your upgrades when you lose all of your lives, which is nice, but a life system should not be in a Zelda game, and they knew that because it doesn't show up in the next game, or the series for that matter. Now, you don't upgrade your sword in this game like in Zelda 1, instead you upgrade your stats, because this game introduces RPG elements, and it's the only game in the series to introduce RPG elements from what I remember. You gain experience from collecting point bags in the game and defeating enemies and bosses, and once you meet the experience requirements, you level up a stat, which can be either health, magic, or attack. Increasing your health means you take more damage resistance, but I honestly didn't feel this one that much, as by the late game, enemies did so much damage no matter what. Increasing magic means your spells cost less magic, which makes this one of the more useful upgrades in the game, as over time, you can increase your magic gauge, which can make magic feel less like a hassle and more like a tool, which I really like. Finally, increasing your attack stat makes your attacks even more powerful, which I don't think I need to explain as to why that is a really useful level up feature. All of these tools, magic, and level up systems were really unique at the time and make you realize that this game was kind of the predecessor to action RPGs that would be popularized by games like Final Fantasy XV, Kingdom Hearts, and The Witcher 3. But that is when we get to the bigger problems of Zelda 2, and why I think this game does not hold up nowadays. The first thing about this game that I don't think holds up is the overworld and secrets in the game. The overworld in this game may take a backseat compared to the first game, but there are still many things in the overworld that I am just not a big fan of. The first of them being the enemy encounters. Now, inherently, I don't mind the idea of having moments where you just fight enemies, but I feel like they do nothing but spam enemies all over the screen for you to fight them just for the sake of it, as the game is not confident in its ability for you to be challenged in the dungeons, as well as the fact that some things in the overworld you need to do to progress through the game, and the game doesn't tell you how to do it or what to do. Like, you need to have this certain tool to be able to clear the trees to find this hidden village, or that you need to have this tool to be able to make the dungeon you need to go through up here right in front of you to progress through the game. You need to make sure you talk to this specific lady so that you can go into her house so that you can get a spell. But for this one, you need to first get the water from the fountain that is the screen away and then give it to the thirsty lady from the previous screen to get a spell. And then you need to travel to another town and use the flute you got to unlock a passage for another spell. It just gives me the same vibe as Castlevania 2, where the game relies on you to know these certain hidden things via the manual or a guide, most likely from Nintendo Power. Sure, in the modern day, this isn't a problem since you could just pull up a guide, but there are plenty of NES games out there that don't rely on you to have a guide to beat them. Hell, the original Metroid, for all of its problems, didn't need you to pull out a guide to know certain things to beat it. This is one of those aspects that really dates a game, especially after a single console generation. We just kinda gave up that mentality. There is also a problem with the game that carries over from the first Zelda game, and that is the difficulty spike is really bad in this one compared to Zelda 1. At first, the game isn't that hard, once you know the ins and outs of the combat and enemies, but the further you get into the game, you realize that the game throws around invisible platforms in the dungeons to throw you off, and that enemies have strange patterns that make them near impossible to really block their projectiles, and that by the end of the game, enemies are near impossible to kill, which makes this one of the harder games in the series. Now, it could be that I wasn't leveled properly, but even knowing about some enemies in the game, they still took forever to kill, and it was near impossible to predict how to defeat them. And then the invisible platforms just made going through later dungeons in this game more annoying, because the one removal that made going through these dungeons already annoying. There's also the fact that the bosses in this game are either the easiest boss in the series or one that is really annoying to fight, which I will get to when I talk a bit about the bosses. By the end of the game, I was just exhausted with it, and mashing the attack button to deal with an enemy was starting to hurt my fingers more than what I already do with just playing Souls games. Now for the dungeons, which all of them have two major problems. The first problem is that there are no puzzles in the dungeons of this game. When the puzzles in Zelda 1's dungeons weren't really puzzles, they were still something to do in the dungeon aside from the fighting. But in Zelda 2, there are no puzzles, which makes them feel more like giant mazes full of enemies, which leads to the other problem with the dungeons, which is that there are no maps for these dungeons, which can lead to you getting lost a lot. There are hallways in the dungeons of this game that just lead to dead ends, which can make you feel like you are lost, and it gets more confusing as you continue through the game and the dungeons get bigger and bigger. So having a map would have been really helpful. Just collecting it and having it show up on the side of the magic menu when you are selecting your magic spell would have saved so many headaches I had going through this game. Especially the final dungeon, where there are paths that just lead to dead ends and you have to travel all the way back to where you were just to continue through it. But if you die enough times, you will lose all of your lives and will need to backtrack all the way to the dungeon, which is really annoying. This is a game that was basically destined to be the black sheep of the Zelda franchise. The bosses I don't really have a lot to say about, since they are either really fucking easy like Mazura and Robanak, or really annoying like Goma or Barba, but none of that compares to the final boss of the game, which is Thunderbird, where you need to first use the thunder spell on him to make him vulnerable for the fight, and then you need to attack his face, but that is also where he shoots his projectiles from, which makes it highly likely that he will damage you when you try and hit him. Also, does it help that halfway through his health bar, he will shoot out the fireballs faster and faster, making it even more annoying. But after you beat him, you are left with one more challenge: fight your dark self to prove that you are worthy of the Triforce of Courage. So you fight Dark Link. And here's a fucking pushover. You get the Triforce of Courage, combine the pieces of the Triforce and wake up Zelda, she gives you a kiss, and roll credits. Needless to say, I did not enjoy my time with Zelda 2. It was a frustrating game with many design elements that bogs down the experience, like its unforgiving life system, its insane difficulty curve, confusing dungeon design, its lack of puzzles, and secrets that are almost cryptic in the modern day. But I do have to give it props for laying the groundwork for action RPGs to come to the future, despite how poorly implemented the RPG systems were, but hey, it's something. Despite my feelings on the NES Zelda games, I can't deny the fact that they were some of the most inspirational games ever made. These games have laid foundations for other genres of games for the future that may not have been the first games in their genres, but Zelda 1 made people explore and discover on their own for years, and Zelda 2 made players feel stronger with each enemy they defeated with a truckload of tools that they had at their disposal, and I think that is enough to cement these games as classics. Not games you need to play again at a heartbeat, but classics for one reason or another. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and as always, have a nice day.